she was just the woman pumping gas into jets. Until 68 gunmen stormed the base in a sandstorm. 16 minutes later, the fuel lines were rigged to explode, the lights were dead, and everyone thought it was over. But here's the twist. The friendly fire mistake that ended her flying career, it wasn't an accident. And the man who set her up just walked back onto the battlefield. What happened next flipped every expectation of survival. And before you see how one simple woman turned the tide of a war, make sure you hit subscribe and ring the bell for A Simple Woman, because the part you're about to hear was never meant to be told. The siren tore through the desert base like a blade. Not a drill, not a test. The kind of alarm that froze even seasoned mechanics mid-step. Outside the wire, the horizon was swallowed by a copper wall of sand, rolling closer like an ocean of dust. Inside that storm, shadows moved, too many, too fast. A second later, the first rocket slammed into the perimeter fence, and the ground jumped under everyone's boots. 68 gunmen, split into strike groups, had come to take the base in the middle of the sandstorm. The power grid collapsed in the opening barrage. Lights blinked out, radios hissed into static, and the operations center went dark. Without warning, the base was blind, cut off, and surrounded. And then came the worst discovery of all. The main fuel lines feeding every aircraft on the strip were rigged with charges. 16 minutes until detonation. If the fuel farm went up, the entire flight line would ignite in a chain reaction. Hundreds of millions in hardware gone, and every man and woman on the ground turned to ash. Ava Rhee tightened her gloves and ducked behind a sandbag wall as another RPG cracked overhead. She hadn't flown in years. She wasn't supposed to. Her new life was in fuel hoses and clipboards, moving from one aircraft to the next, the ghost of a pilot who'd lost her wings. Officially, she was here to keep jets full, nothing more. But fate doesn't care about official orders. She smelled it first, the sharp bite of jet fuel leaking, cut by the acrid stench of fire. Then she heard the coughing. Corporal Mateo Cruz was pinned under a twisted pipe near the main valve, flames crawling closer to the spill. Without thinking, Ava sprinted across open ground, rounds zipping past. She slammed her shoulder into the wreckage, pulled until her muscles screamed, and dragged the kid clear. Smoke filled her lungs, heat blistered her face. For one heartbeat, the flames became tracers in her mind, and she was back in the cockpit on the night everything had gone wrong. That night had carved her name out of the sky, a miscoded set of coordinates, a JTAC's voice crackling over the net, and then her guns shredding friendlies who were never supposed to be there. One mistake, or so the record said, one catastrophe that ended her flying career. She remembered the silence afterward, the way command refused to hear her defense. They took her wings, buried her under a new call sign, pipeline, forever chained to the fuel lines. Now, with Cruz coughing in her arms, the nightmare returned. Her chest locked, her hands trembled. For a split second, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The fire hissed, ready to take them both. Cruz's voice snapped her out of it. "Don't stop, please." She forced her legs to move, dragging him behind cover as medics rushed in. He would live. She had pulled him out in time. But the fire still licked closer to the valves, and the timer on the explosives kept ticking. Across the strip, Colonel Trent Marlowe barked into a backup handset, his voice brittle with command. "Support stays in place. Do not improvise. Do not interfere. Stay in your lane." His gaze swept the chaos until it landed on her. To him, she was exactly what the record said, a washed-up pilot who had killed her own, demoted to a role she should be grateful for. He saw her crouched behind sandbags, soot on her face, and his eyes narrowed with disdain. But Ava's eyes were somewhere else, on the revetment at the far end of the flight line. Through dust and flame, its silhouette loomed, stubby wings, shark mouth, painted across the nose, heavy gun muzzle glinting under the storm light. An A-10 Warthog, the aircraft that had once made her a terror to enemies and a curse to herself. Her curse, her cage. She felt her stomach turn, her body screaming not to look, yet every part of her leaned toward it, like gravity itself was pulling her back into the cockpit she swore she'd never touch again. Outside the wire, a man lowered his binoculars and smiled through the sandstorm. Darius Volkov, mercenary commander, ex-pilot, the one who had falsified those fire coordinates years ago, turning her into the scapegoat of friendly fire. She had never known the truth, only that command had buried her without a hearing. But Volkov remembered. He had come back for one reason, to finish her. He wanted the base. He wanted the Warthog. And most of all, he wanted her to know who had destroyed her. The storm roared louder. Gunfire raked the berms. Explosions rippled closer to the flight line. 16 minutes until fire consumed everything. Ava pressed her back against the sandbags, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't supposed to fight. She wasn't supposed to fly. But her instincts whispered what the colonel never would. If she didn't get back into that cockpit, nobody was getting out alive. The storm swallowed the base whole. Dust clawed into every open seam, turning day into a copper twilight where shapes moved like ghosts. The generators had been the first to go, detonated in the initial barrage, plunging the operations center into black silence. Radios sputtered with static, screens went blank. The nerve center of the installation had flatlined. Panic filled the vacuum. Mechanics and clerks scrambled in the dark, clutching rifles they hadn't fired in months. Medics dragged the wounded into hangars, their flashlights jittering across torn metal and blood-streaked concrete. Shouts overlapped, half of them lost in the roar of wind. Colonel Marlowe's voice bellowed through a backup loudspeaker, brittle and furious. "Hold the line! Stay in position!" No deviations. But his words didn't match the chaos around him. Men were running in every direction, not because of cowardice, but because nobody could see or hear where the fight was breaking next. Through the storm came a new rhythm, the staccato beat of machine guns pounding from the perimeter. Volkov's mercenaries had cut the base into sectors, pinning defenders with overlapping fields of fire. Small squads advanced low through the dust, planting satchel charges along the maintenance sheds. Abu Rahim's fighters chanted over the comms, voices carried by hand, radios that crackled just loud enough for the Americans to hear. Psychological warfare layered over real bullets. Ava crouched behind a line of sandbags, the fuel farm blazing 30 yards away. The fire reflected in her visor, painting her face in orange light. She knew the math in her bones. If the fire reached the main lines or if those charges blew, the flight line would be a crater. She forced herself to focus, to cut through the noise. Her breathing steadied. She counted silhouettes in the haze. 2 squads advancing from the south berm, another from the maintenance road. Their timing was deliberate, coordinated. This wasn't chaos. It was precision. Volkov's hand all over it. Corporal Cruz, pale and coughing but still on his feet, knelt beside her, fumbling with the safety of his rifle. His hands shook. "Sergeant, what do we do?" She looked at him, and for the first time since the attack began, gave an answer without hesitation. "Angles," she muttered, eyes narrowing. "They're corralling us. South Squad will breach first. They'll pin us down, then the road team will swing through." Cruz stared at her. "How do you know?" Ava didn't look away from the storm. "Because that's exactly how I do it." A burst of gunfire confirmed it. South berm flared with muzzle flashes, and men poured through the wire. The defenders staggered, their fire scattered and panicked. Marlowe's loudspeaker screamed, "Hold your sectors!" But his order was already obsolete. Ava grabbed Cruz by the vest and pulled him to new cover before the incoming fire shredded the wall behind them. Her body moved before her mind gave permission. Years of training, buried under dust and shame, resurfaced like instinct. Lieutenant Paige Sutter, the JTAC, stumbled into the trench where Ava and Cruz hunkered down, her headset sparking with static. "I can't raise anyone outside the wire." she barked. "They're jamming us to hell." Ava's eyes flicked to the little drone buzzing faintly above the smoke. "It's Volkov. He's cutting command in half. He wants us deaf." Sutter blinked at her. "How the hell do you know his playbook?" Ava didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. The past wasn't theory anymore. It was back, hunting her. Another explosion rocked the tarmac. A hangar door collapsed, fire chewing through the frame. The smell of burning rubber and hydraulic fluid coated the air. Ava forced her brain to slow down, to treat the battlefield like a map instead of a nightmare. "They're not hitting the aircraft," she realized out loud. "They're circling them. They want them intact." Cruz frowned. "Why? To steal them?" Ava shook her head. "Not steal, film them. Propaganda. They want to show the world they took our teeth." Sutter swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the revetments where the silent hulks of fighters and one lone A-10 crouched under the storm. Ava could almost hear Volkov's voice in her head, mocking her, dragging her back to the night of her disgrace. He wanted her plane. He wanted to erase her for good. Marlowe stormed into the trench with 2 aides, face streaked with dust, rage bright in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing out here? You're fuel support, not combat." His words spat like bullets. Ava didn't flinch. "They'll breach the south sector in 2 minutes. If you keep every squad glued to their posts, they'll get rolled. You need to collapse the flanks and reinforce the center." Marlowe's eyes blazed. "Don't you dare tell me tactics, Sergeant. You lost that right when you killed your own." The words stabbed deeper than the dust in her lungs, but they didn't silence her. "You're about to lose this base if you don't adapt. Look around you. Your plan's already broken." Her voice didn't rise, it cut. The colonel hesitated just long enough for another RPG to smash into the next bunker, showering them all in grit. His aides ducked. Cruz stared at Ava with wide eyes. Even Sutter's lips parted. For the first time since the attack began, silence pressed between the blasts. Ava hadn't shouted, hadn't begged. She had just spoken like a pilot again, crisp and certain, the way she used to over the radio when lives depended on her tone. The sound of it made even Marlowe falter. He clenched his jaw, then snapped at his aides. "Shift the 2nd platoon to the center line. Double up the MG nests." Orders carried. The fight tilted, slightly but enough. Ava didn't wait for thanks. She gripped her rifle tighter, eyes back on the storm. Her heart still thundered with old ghosts, but her instincts had taken the wheel. She was improvising patterns, reading angles, anticipating movements. She had stepped outside her punishment, if only for a moment. And for the first time in years it felt like she was flying again, without leaving the ground. Outside the wire, Volkov watched through his binoculars as his squads adjusted, driving deeper into the base. The storm raged, the timer on the fuel lines ticked, and a smile tugged at his scarred lips. He could feel her presence. He could feel her fighting back. And that was exactly what he wanted. The sandstorm thickened until the base felt like an island adrift in a red ocean. Visibility dropped to 100 yards, then 50. Dust scoured every surface, stung every eye. The storm was an enemy all its own, but Volkov was using it like a shield. From the southern berm came a new sound, the harsh hiss and thump of shoulder-fired rockets launching through the haze. "Man pads!" Sutter screamed into her headset, ducking as a contrail cut overhead. A fuel truck went up in a ball of fire, fragments clattering across the tarmac. Another streak of fire arced toward the command post, forcing men to scatter as the roof collapsed under the blast. The mercenaries weren't just harassing now, they were choking the runway itself. Every escape path was being bricked shut, missile by missile. Ava knew the pattern instantly. It was the same strategy Volkov had used years ago when he'd been flying black market intercept. Missions: close the sky, starve the defenders of air cover, trap them on the ground. Only this time, he wasn't piloting, he was orchestrating. She clenched her teeth. He'd stolen her tactics, twisted them, and now he was turning them back against her. Colonel Marlowe's voice came ragged over the battered loudspeaker. No aircraft leaves the ground. Repeat, no aircraft launches until the perimeter is secure. It was madness, and everyone knew it. Without planes, the base was just a coffin waiting for its lid. But Marlowe couldn't see it. He was trapped in protocol. His eyes cut toward Ava again, full of rage and fear. "You stay away from those birds," he barked. "You even touch a cockpit and I'll have you in irons." Ava didn't answer. Her gaze had already drifted toward Revetment 7, where the squat silhouette of the A-10 crouched like a predator in chains. Dust swirled around its nose, shark teeth grinning through the storm. She felt her throat tighten. Her body started to shake, and she hated it. Just looking at the cockpit made her chest seize, memory clawing up her spine. The last time she had strapped in, she had walked away branded a killer. Her hands had ended friendlies. Her career, her identity, her pride, all burned out in one night of fire and static. Cruz appeared at her side, blood still dried on his face from the earlier rescue. "Sergeant," he said, voice unsteady but steadying her nonetheless. "That hog is the only thing they're afraid of. I saw their faces when it taxied last year. They don't care about our rifles, they care about that gun." He pointed toward the A-10's nose cannon, the GAU-8, its muzzle dark but looming. "They're sealing the runway because of it. You know what that means." She swallowed hard. Her legs felt rooted to the sand. Part of her screamed to stay put, to hide, to let someone else carry the weight. But another part whispered, low and insistent, "This is yours. It was always yours." Another explosion ripped through the line. The bunker shielding the fuel farm collapsed, and flames leapt higher, illuminating the storm like a furnace. The heat rolled across the strip. If the main tanks went, the base would become a crater visible from orbit. Sutter's voice cracked as she turned to Ava. "We've got no choice. If you can't get airborne, we're finished." Ava's pulse hammered. She forced herself forward, step by step, across the wind-lashed tarmac. Every foot closer to the Warthog felt like walking deeper into a grave. The canopy glistened with dust. The ladder rattled in the gale. She reached up, laid her hand against the cold metal of the fuselage, and her body betrayed her. Tremors racked her arms, her lungs locked. She couldn't breathe. She saw the HUD again, the green reticle snapping to the wrong coordinates, the JTAC's voice breaking in static. She smelled burning flesh, heard screams that had lived in her skull for years. She doubled over, hands braced on her knees, choking on dust and memory. Cruz's hand landed on her shoulder. "Sergeant, look at me. You pulled me out of that fire. You didn't freeze then. Don't freeze now. We need you." His words hammered at the walls of her fear. "I don't care what they said about you. I only care what you do right here." She looked at him, saw the raw desperation in his eyes, the kind she'd once carried for her own leaders. Something cracked inside her, not weakness but defiance. Her breathing slowed. She straightened, wiped dust from her face and set her jaw. The storm howled as she climbed the ladder, one rung at a time. Her boots found the cockpit, her body slid into the seat. The straps tightened across her chest. The smell of hydraulic fluid filled her lungs. Her hands still trembled as they wrapped around the stick. But this time, she didn't pull away. She forced her fingers to stay, to remember the shape, the weight, the promise. Systems blinked awake, one by one. Avionics flickered in the storm light. The gun's arming tone purred low, almost hungry. Her headset crackled with Sutter's voice. "Pipeline. If you're in there, we've rigged a makeshift runway. Headlights, flares, whatever we could grab. It's not standard, but it's all we've got." Ava's lips parted, the first words she'd spoken into a cockpit mic in years. Her voice was low, graveled, but steady. "Copy, JTAC, show me the lights." Somewhere beyond the storm, Volkov lowered his binoculars and bared his teeth. The trap had worked. She was back in the seat, exactly where he wanted her. The base had no runway lights left. The storm had eaten the horizon, swallowed the sun, and smothered every beacon that once guided pilots home. But scattered along the tarmac, headlights from Humvees and pickup. Trucks blinked through the dust, a jagged makeshift line of light. Master Sergeant Jonah Pike had pulled every vehicle he could find into formation. Mechanics leaned on horns, drivers revved engines, beams cutting thin corridors into the storm. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the cockpit, Ava tightened her harness and stared through the canopy into a blur of dust. Her instruments flickered, airspeed indicator ready, attitude gyro trembling under turbulence. She'd flown combat sorties at night in rain in hostile skies, but never in a storm that turned the world into blindness. She felt the tremor rising in her chest, the itch of memory threatening to crack her composure. Then Sutter's voice came steady over the net, grounding her. Pipeline, runway improvised. Vehicles aligned 3,000 feet. Winds cross from the west. We'll flare at the end. Call your roll. Her fingers gripped the throttle. Her lips pressed together. Copy. Rolling. The engines roared to life, twin turbines howling, pulling air and sand into a vortex. The aircraft shuddered as she released the brakes. Slowly at first, then faster. The A-10's wheels hammered across broken asphalt, past shadows of men crouched behind. Headlights, faces hidden in goggles and scarves, but eyes locked on the hog. Every second, her vision blurred worse. Dust clawed at the canopy. It was like flying through smoke, like diving blind into a cloud. The airspeed needle climbed. 90 knots, 110. The runway was running out, headlights vanishing in the storm. She grit her teeth. Come on, come on. 130. She pulled. The nose lifted. The hog broke free. For a heartbeat, it felt like falling off a cliff. The storm punched her wings, crosswinds tearing at the frame. Warning lights blinked. She steadied her grip, corrected yaw, fought the aircraft like wrestling a beast in the dark. Then the altitude tape climbed. She was airborne. The base below erupted, not in cheers, not in noise, but in silence. Men who had been screaming orders and firing blindly stopped, looked up into the storm, and felt a surge of something stronger than fear. The hog was in the sky. The fight wasn't lost. Volkov's mercenaries saw it too. Their heads tilted, eyes wide, hands tightening on rifles. They had built their plan on one assumption, that the A-10s would stay cold on the ground. Volkov hissed into his radio. Manpads teams, eyes up. Bring her down now. Ava scanned instruments, barely able to see her own wings. She couldn't fight the storm, but she could trust her training. She listened to the air, the way the stick tugged under crosswind, the subtle vibration as sand scraped her fuselage. She turned where her instincts told her, rolling into the fight. Her radar warning tone screamed, the shrill wail of a missile lock. She dropped flares. A streak of fire hissed past her canopy, missing by yards. Another lock. She banked hard, felt the G-forces press against her chest, but the hog held. The A-10 was a tank with wings, built to absorb punishment. And tonight, it had a pilot with nothing left to lose. Target South Berm, Sutter called, her voice cutting through static, heavy weapons nest chewing us alive. Coordinates. Ava cut her off. I see them. Her eyes had already locked on the faint flashes through dust, the strobing arcs of muzzle fire. She nosed down, the reticle sliding into place. Her thumb flicked the master arm. The gun armed with a growl, a mechanical thunder that vibrated through the frame. She squeezed. The GAU-8 Avenger unleashed hell. 30mm rounds tore from the barrel at nearly 70 per second, a torrent of depleted uranium that chewed through sand, steel, and flesh alike. The sound wasn't gunfire. It was a buzzsaw ripping the sky. On the ground, Volkov's men screamed, their nest exploding into fire and shards. The survivors scattered, some throwing rifles down, others firing wildly into dust. Direct hit, Sutter shouted, but Ava wasn't listening. She swung wide, lined up the maintenance road where another squad had been advancing. The reticle found them. She pressed again. The guns spat flame, trucks flipped, men vanished in firestorms. The maintenance road became a graveyard. Below, the defenders felt the shift. Every burst from the Hog's cannon was more than destruction. It was a promise. They weren't trapped anymore. They had teeth. The cheers started low, from one trench, then another, until they rolled across the base like thunder. Volkov slammed his fist against the side of his vehicle. "Keep firing, she's one pilot, one, bleed her out." But even his mercenaries faltered, because they knew what the Hog meant. They had seen villages leveled, armored columns turned to husks, all by that roar in the sky. And now it hunted them in a storm they thought was their ally. Ava pulled up, dust streaking across her canopy, sweat burning her eyes. Her breathing came fast but steady. She'd broken the seal. She was flying again. Not perfect, not free of ghosts, but alive, lethal, herself. For the first time in years, her voice carried into the radio like it used to. Calm, commanding, certain, targets neutralized, send me the next. Sutter's reply came with awe. Copy that, Hog 1. Next vector inbound. The storm raged on, the fire still threatened the fuel farm, and Volkov's plan was far from finished. But for the first time since the attack began, the battlefield bent away from him, and he knew it. The storm had thinned just enough for shadows to take shape. From her altitude, Ava could see bursts of fire on the perimeter, Volkov's squads still pressing in, though broken and ragged. But something about their movements gnawed at her. They weren't retreating. They were circling, herding the defenders, driving them toward the fuel farm where the fire already licked at the valves. Her gut clenched. Sutter's voice cracked through her headset. Pipeline. New development. We intercepted their radio chatter. They're talking about... The line hissed, jammed for a moment, then cleared. They're talking about a show. They want you on the ground. They want to capture the Hog intact. Ava's knuckles whitened on the stick. That explained a bizarre pattern. Their restraint around the aircraft, their obsession with the runway. It wasn't just about destroying the base. It was about humiliation. They wanted the symbol of the A-10 turned into a trophy, and in the heart of the storm, Darius Volkov was waiting to deliver it. Her radar picked up a flicker, an uplink not from the ground battle but from a separate frequency. Then, like a ghost, Volkov's voice slid into her headset, hijacking her comms. "Pipeline," he said smoothly, his accent still sharp, still venomous. "It's been too long. Do you remember the night they cut your wings?" "I do." Her breath caught. She didn't answer. He chuckled, low and cruel. "You thought it was a mistake. A JTAC giving you bad coordinates, friendlies caught in your line of fire. Command eager to bury the scandal. You were convenient, disposable." His voice hardened. "But that mission wasn't an accident. It was mine. I falsified the laser codes, ghosted your HUD. You never had a chance." The cockpit seemed to shrink around her. The roar of engines dulled under the pounding of her heartbeat. Volkov's words snapped chains she'd carried for years. The endless guilt, the silence from command, the nightmare that had eaten her alive. It hadn't been her mistake, it had been his. Her voice rasped out, steady but burning. "You ruined me." Volkov laughed. "I liberated you from illusions. Now tonight, I'll finish the story. I'll take your Warthog intact, and the world will see the legend turned to scrap under my boot." On the ground, Colonel Marlowe stood in the shattered comms shack, listening as the hacked transmission bled into his feed. His face went pale, his rigid posture cracking. All these years he had treated her as guilty, had wielded her disgrace as proof that obedience mattered more than instinct. But the truth was now slamming into him with every word from Volkov. The colonel's iron faith in the record had been a weapon aimed at the wrong target. Sutter's eyes locked on him. "Sir, you heard it." She was set up. Marlowe's jaw trembled. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. For years he had barked her down, told her she had no right to speak of tactics, no right to fly. But in the storm above, he heard the calm steadiness of a pilot who had never failed, only been betrayed, and the weight of his error crashed into him. Ava's voice came again, this time not broken but forged in steel. "Volkov, you can choke on your trophies. You'll never touch this Hog. She cut comms, shutting him out, and the silence that followed felt like thunder. On the ground, Marlowe exhaled sharply, as if something inside him had broken loose. He raised his own radio, eyes hard now, not with disdain, but with clarity. "All units," he said, his voice carrying across every surviving net. "Operational command is transferring. Pipeline Rhee has the sky, she has the fight. Follow her lead." His aides stared, stunned. Sutter blinked, then snapped a salute at nothing but the static-filled air. For the first time, the colonel had admitted the truth, not just that she was innocent, but that she was the only one who could save them now. Above the storm, Ava steadied her breath. For years she had flown under the weight of guilt, her hands chained by memory. Now she flew with something new, fury sharpened into purpose. The ghosts weren't gone, but they no longer owned her. She had a name to erase, a mercenary to bury, and a base to save. "JTAC," she said into the net, her voice low but electric. "Feed me the next target." The battlefield was a furnace now. Fire from ruptured pipelines licked at the edge of the flight line, painting the storm in searing orange. Volkov's mercenaries pressed harder, their chants and gunfire blending with the roar of the storm. They weren't retreating, they were converging, on the fuel farm, on the A-10's revetment, on her. Ava's eyes scanned the chaos below. Every squad moved with the same intent: drive defenders inward, push them against the fuel lines, force the Americans to choke on their own fire. She understood in a flash. The battle wasn't about killing everyone on base. It was about spectacle, a captured A-10, a base consumed in flames. Volkov wanted the world to see it. Her jaw set. "Not tonight. JTAC," she snapped into comms. "Mark me a corridor through the farm." Sutter's voice was strained, nearly drowned by gunfire. "Pipeline, if you light that corridor, the whole farm could. Trust me." Ava cut her off. She banked low, the hog's wings skimming the dust like a predator stooping on prey. The reticle locked across a line of leaking fuel. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 thundered. Rounds tore into the ground, cutting the line open wider, spraying raw fuel into the storm air. One spark was enough. The world below erupted into a curtain of flame that rose 20 feet high, a wall of fire, a living barrier slamming down between Volkov's squads. His forces split, isolated on either side of the inferno. Screams filled the storm. Men stumbled back, blinded by heat and smoke, their coordination collapsing. Volkov's perfect encirclement was shattered. In seconds, Ava pulled up through the turbulence, the hog trembling but steady. Her voice came cold and even. "That's your wall. Push them back." On the ground, defenders surged with renewed fury, emboldened by the sudden division of their attackers. The base, moments from collapse, was fighting again. Volkov roared into his radio, demanding cohesion, but the fire answered louder than he could. His men were cut off, choking in the smoke, their lines broken beyond repair. He knew it, and Ava knew he knew it, but the victory was not clean. As Ava looped wide for another run, her warning lights blazed red. Hydraulic pressure dropping, left gear damaged. She'd taken a hit in the pass, maybe shrapnel, maybe small arms, and now the hog limped. She gritted her teeth, forcing it level. The firestorm had bought time, but it had also sealed her fate. She'd have to land. "Pipeline, this is JTAC," Sutter said, voice cracking. "Runway's half gone. You're missing a wheel. You try to put her down, you might not walk away." Ava's lips pressed into a line. She looked down at the fractured base. Defenders bloodied but still standing. Crews firing from behind sandbags despite his bandaged chest, Pike waving men into positions along the firewall. They had given everything. It was her turn. She breathed once, deep and steady. "Clear me a strip. I'm coming in." Engines screamed as she angled into final approach. The storm whipped against her, crosswinds snarling, dust erasing the ground beneath. Headlights from battered vehicles marked a jagged path. Men along the line stopped fighting for one moment to look up. They all knew what was about to happen. "Gear check," she muttered. "Right wheel green, nose wheel green, left wheel dead," she exhaled. "All right, girl, let's dance." The hog descended, the tarmac rushing up in flashes through the dust. At 90 knots, she dropped the right wheel. Screech of contact, sparks showering behind. Nose wheel slammed, frame juddering. The missing wheel dragged metal across asphalt, showering sparks like fireworks, threatening to flip the aircraft sideways. She fought the stick with every muscle in her arms, teeth gritted, eyes locked forward. The hog skidded, groaned, metal grinding against stone. Flames leapt on either side. The storm howled. For one impossible moment, it looked as though the beast would topple. But Ava held it level, coaxed it straight, guiding it down like wrestling a bull to the dirt. The aircraft finally screeched to a halt, nose buried in dust, wings trembling but intact. Silence crashed over the base. Then, slowly, defenders rose from cover, their eyes locked on the sight of her hog blocking the breach, like a steel wall dropped from the sky. Ava sat in the cockpit, chest heaving, sweat stinging her eyes. She looked out through the canopy, through fire and storm, at men who were still alive because she hadn't given up. She let herself smile once, thin, tired, but real. On the other side of the flames, Volkov's rage boiled over. His perfect plan lay in ruins, his prize untouchable, his army broken by fire, and a woman he had thought buried in disgrace. For the first time that night, he tasted fear. The storm began to ease, its fury unraveling into thin veils of dust that drifted across the broken base. Fires still burned at the edges of the fuel farm, but the inferno wall Ava had created now smoldered in patches, leaving black scars where Volkov's squads had tried to push through. The battlefield smelled of smoke, hot metal, and cordite. From her cockpit, Ava watched defenders rise cautiously from cover. Medics rushed into the open, pulling the wounded to safety. Pike barked orders to reform perimeter lines. Even the young Corporal Cruz, bloody and staggering, refused to collapse until others were moved before him. Against all odds, they were still here. The base still lived. Across the flames, Volkov's mercenaries began to fracture. Some threw down rifles and fled into the desert, their shadows swallowed by thinning dust. Others shouted in panic, trying to find leadership that no longer existed. Abu Rahim's fighters broke ranks first, abandoning the assault entirely. They had come for spectacle, not suicide. Volkov's plan had disintegrated. Volkov himself stood on the hood of a truck, face carved with rage. Through his binoculars he saw the A-10, scarred but intact, its nose still pointed like a defiant snarl at the field he had meant to own. He hurled the binoculars into the dirt. "Retreat!" he bellowed into his radio. "Fall back!" His voice cracked, half fury, half disbelief. This was supposed to be his masterpiece. An American base humiliated, and A-10 paraded as a prize. Instead, he had been outflanked by the very woman he had tried to erase. As his convoy limped into the storm, Ava powered down the hog, the engines coughing into silence. She released her harness and climbed down the ladder, boots hitting the dirt hard. Every eye turned to her. Soldiers, mechanics, medics. They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They simply watched her walk across the tarmac, the storm light haloing around her as if the battlefield itself acknowledged what she had done. Colonel Marlowe approached, dust streaking his once pristine uniform. For a moment he stood stiff, words caught in his throat. Then, slowly, he removed his cap and bowed his head. Not a grand salute, not the bark of authority, but an admission. His voice was hoarse. "I was wrong. About you, about everything." He looked up at her, eyes raw. "This base owes you its life. I owe you my trust." Ava said nothing at first. She looked past him, at the men and women who had fought through the storm, at the burned-out vehicles marking the improvised runway, at the hog that had once been her curse and was now her redemption. When she finally spoke, her words were quiet but carried. It wasn't me alone. It was all of you. But if you want the truth, it wasn't luck either. It was method. It was choice. Later, in the after-action briefing, Pike, Sutter and Cruz sat with her around a scarred table recording the night's events. They didn't call it doctrine, not yet, but they noted the patterns Ava had drilled into them in the chaos. Conserve energy, act with precision, move only when it mattered. Her way wasn't about brute force or blind obedience. It was about judgment, about knowing when to break a line of fire to save a life, when to defy a failing order to protect the mission. The defenders began to whisper about it as they rebuilt the base. The younger ones gave it a name almost without thinking: the pipeline method. What had been a punishment, a nickname for disgrace, became instead the label for survival. Days later, as engineers repaired the runway and the last of the wreckage was cleared, Ava stood once more beside the Hog. Its fuselage was scorched, one wheel still missing, but it stood. She placed her hand on its skin, feeling the warmth of sun and fire alike. For years, the cockpit had been her prison. Now it was proof. She hadn't lost her wings. She had only been waiting for the right storm to fly again. The desert night fell quiet at last. The fires burned low, the sand settled, and the base that should have been nothing but ash still stood. Soldiers slumped against walls, exhausted but alive, their eyes heavy with disbelief. They had been minutes from annihilation, yet the enemy had fled, broken by fire, steel, and the will of one pilot who refused to surrender. Ava Rhee walked the line of battered defenders, boots crunching in soot. They looked up as she passed, not with cheers or salutes, but with something weightier: recognition. They had seen her take the storm head-on. They had seen her break the siege with the roar of a gun that could not be silenced. And in their silence, she felt more than applause. She felt acceptance. At the far edge of the field, the A-10 rested in its revetment, scorched, bent, missing a wheel, but proud. It looked like it had clawed its way out of hell and dared anyone to challenge it again. Ava placed her palm against the hot steel. For years, this aircraft had haunted her dreams, a reminder of shame and a past she could not escape. Tonight, it had become something else: redemption. Proof that her instincts, her choices, her courage still mattered. Colonel Marlowe approached, his uniform still stained with smoke, and for once his voice carried no command, only humility. "You didn't just save this base," he said quietly. "You saved me from my own blindness. You showed us that survival doesn't come from rules on paper. It comes from the choices we make when the rules collapse." He bowed his head, and Ava let the moment stand. She turned back toward the defenders, her voice carrying low but steady. "You all fought through the storm. You all stood when everything said you couldn't. Remember this night. Remember that survival isn't about being the strongest, but about being the one who chooses the right path when the wrong one is easier." The storm clouds parted, revealing a sky scattered with stars. Ava looked up once, then back at the faces waiting for her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight on her chest lift. She wasn't a ghost chained to a fuel hose. She wasn't a mistake buried in reports. She was a pilot again. And if you've stayed with her story to this moment, ask yourself, when the fire closes in, when the storm blinds you, will you freeze or will you choose to fight? That's the heartbeat of every story we tell here. Subscribe now and ring the bell for A Simple Woman. And in the comments, tell us, what would you have done in her boots?